The following is excerpted from Anna Louise Strong's The New Soviet Constitution, a study in socialist democracy. From all these far scattered parts of the Soviet land and all its many peoples, the delegates came at last to Moscow, to the white marble hall of the Kremlin Palace. They were quite obviously a cross-section of all nationalities and occupations, totally unlike lawyer-constituted parliaments of capitalist lands, unlike any government that has ever existed in the world before. Uzbek men in brilliant striped robes, Cossacks in uniforms of red and black or red and blue, and women with gaily flowered shawls added color to the gathering. On scores of breasts were seen government decorations, the Order of Lenin, the Order of the Red Banner, marking their weavers as persons who had made some signal contribution to the country or attained eminence in science, art, productive labor, famous aviators, scientists, tractor drivers, blacksmiths, milkmaids. The entire Congress, in fact, had been chosen by their fellows not for brilliance in debate, but as the most brilliantly productive people in the country. Productive in all lines: grain, iron, airplanes, art. It is clear that such must be a Congress in a socialist state, where the main task of government is the rapid and efficient production of plenty for all. A comparison of this Congress with the Second Congress of Soviets in 1924, which adopted the first constitution of the Union, shows many significant facts of growth. There were 2,016 deputies, 481 more than in 1924. This reflects a population growth of 30 million, 6 times Germany's growth in that period, and the emergence of 8 new cities with a total population of 1 million. 63 nationalities were present, testifying to the vast variety of the USSR. A significant change was the increase in the number of women. There were 419, more than 1/5 the total number of delegates, 5 times as many as in 1924. Nearly half of them, 177, came from rural districts and ranged from cotton pickers and dairy women to combine operators and presidents of farms. Among the 142 women classed as workers, there were 63 different trades, including locomotive engineers, weavers, locksmiths, and dynamiters. Professional women included 47 village and township presidents, 2 actresses, 3 aviators, 18 teachers, and 5 directors of factories. Clearly, the past 10 years have brought Soviet women into every branch of occupation. The farmers among the delegates differed sharply from those who attended the 1924 Congress. There were more of them. In the earlier Congress, all were individual peasants, giving their occupation usually as grain growers. Now, all were collective farmers, listing themselves by specialties: combine operators, tractor drivers, managers of livestock, pig raisers, farm presidents, cotton and tea pickers. Besides their farm work, 63% of them were unpaid members of local governments. Among them was a famous combine operator, Palagotin, holder of the all-union record; Koverdak, a tawny-skinned Kazakh girl who plowed 12,812 acres last season with a crawler tractor; Marie Demchenko, known throughout the land as last year's sugar beet celebrity, but who this year is a student in an agricultural college; Christine Badich, mother of 3 grown children, who this year doubled Marie's record and produced 40 tons of sugar beets per acre; the picturesque Rachmatov, former half-starved Uzbek farmhand who this year, as brigade leader in a collective farm, raised the cotton yield from the usual Uzbek standard of 2/5 ton per acre to the incredible figure of more than 4 tons per acre. These men and women were described by Stalin as an entirely new peasantry, the like of which history has not seen. University graduates furnished 289 delegates, in contrast to 90 in the Congress of 1924, 3/4 of them had received their education under the Soviets. Stalin spoke, reporting for the Constitutional Commission. Behind him on a high platform sat the 30 members of the Presidium just elected. Before him was an ocean of faces. On the main floor, the delegates. Above them, a great gallery of visitors, with the People's Front delegation from the battle lines of Spain holding the front row. Diplomats from many nations sat in boxes. From the press gallery, the representatives of the world's news services rushed out with half-hourly telegrams to keep pace with the afternoon editions in New York. Across the Soviet country, from the icebound polar night of Dixon Island to the cotton farms of Central Asia, from army outposts on the Manchurian frontier to great mass meetings in Leningrad and Moscow, and even beyond in the borders of European capitals, tens of millions on the radio listened in. Stalin spoke slowly, quietly, distinctly, in a conversational tone with few gestures. Men afterwards said it was as if he talked to each of them personally. He paused for the right word. He was unhurried. He found exactly the right word and gave it. He outlined the reasons for a new constitution, the changes in the life of the USSR, an industry 7 times pre-war, an agriculture 50% higher. The national income increased 4-fold. Most importantly, the complete victory of the socialist system through the establishment of socialist ownership of the means of production as the basis of Soviet society. New people emerging, a new type of worker, farmer, intellectual. The limits of the new constitution and its principal characteristics were treated next. It expressed the attainment of socialism, said Stalin, but not yet that of communism. The mainstays of socialism were 1. Socialist ownership of land, forests, factories, and other means of production. Society no longer consisted of antagonistic classes, but of 2 classes, workers and peasants, friendly to each other. Work had become a duty and matter of honor for all citizens. The capitalist assumption of national and race inequality was replaced by the premise that neither language nor color of skin nor cultural backwardness nor the stage of political development can justify national and race inequality. Claiming for the new constitution, consistent, thoroughgoing democracy, the only thoroughly consistent democratic constitution in the world. Stalin took up the various criticisms of the document expressed abroad, the Nazi denunciation of it as an empty promise, the claim of other critics that it was a shift toward the right. These gentlemen do not know the difference between left and right, he remarked amid laughter from the delegates. Many suggested amendments were next considered. Some Stalin approved as facilitating democratic self-expression. Others he disapproved as contrary to the spirit of Soviet democracy. He opposed those people who would strike out the right of free secession. The voluntary nature of the Union, he said, must be emphasized. He opposed the election of the president of the Supreme Soviet by popular vote. Such focusing of attention on one man and setting him over against the Supreme Soviet did not harmonize, he said, with the spirit of our constitution. Soviet democracy is collegial in form. He opposed the demand to forbid religious rights and continued the disfranchisement of the clergy. The time has come to introduce universal suffrage without any limitations. He ended by stating briefly but eloquently the historic significance of the new constitution, an indictment against fascism, an indictment which says that socialism and democracy are invincible, that what has been realized in the USSR can be fully realized in other countries also, that the blood abundantly shed by our people was not in vain. During a 10-day session, the delegates of the Congress, peasant women, government leaders, industrial workers, world-renowned scientists, picturesque Cossacks, made speeches announcing local and national achievements, summing up in homely but significant detail the end of one epoch and the beginning of a new one. An editorial commission elected by the Congress prepared the final text of the Constitution, including amendments. Stalin reported for the commission at the concluding session of the Congress in a 15-minute speech. 43 amendments were made, including substantial changes. To the clause granting use of land to collective farms without time limit, there was added, and without payment. The Supreme Soviet was given 11 vice presidents instead of 4, and required to publish all laws in 11 official languages, this corresponding to the number of constituent republics. The Soviet of Nationalities was given an increased membership to make it equal to that of the Soviet of the Union, and provision was made that it should be elected by popular vote instead of appointed by the constituent governments. A new Commissariat of Defense Industries was created, the provision permitting the Presidium to declare a state of war in case of armed attack upon USSR. There was added, or in case of the need of fulfilling international treaty obligations of mutual defense against aggression. This last amendment provoked a sudden burst of applause. The full text of the new Constitution as revised was read and adopted article by article. After every article, the chairman asked if there was any more amendments. And when cries of no answered, he put the vote for, against, and abstaining. The delegates voted by raising their red credential cards, which blossomed and waved across the hall like a poppy field. The voting at first proceeded without demonstration, but when Chapter 10 on the basic rights and duties of citizens was reached, the delegates broke into applause on the statement of the right to work. This was repeated for the rest of the basic rights. 146 times for 146 articles, the red flowers of assent blossomed and waved above the assembly. Then, the Congress decisively refused a roll call on the final adoption, which they carried with cheers and singing. Without the help of a band, but firmly and clearly, the 2016 delegates sang 3 stanzas of the International. December 5th was declared a national holiday, Day of the Constitution. Next morning, in all the cities and villages of the USSR, tens of millions of people poured into the wintry streets and roads and squares to welcome with flags and banners and floats and bands the world's first constitution of an achieved socialist state.
Welcome to Prolespod.
Welcome back to Prolespod. This is Tony. As you've likely caught on by now, we're in the midst of releasing a special project we've dubbed the Stalin Eras. Each of these Stalin Eras episodes will build upon the last in terms of themes and narratives, as well as the general trajectory of both Joseph Stalin and the socialist project to which he dedicated his life. For that reason, while we understand that some folks might be particularly interested in one era over the other, we do suggest listening to the episodes in order so that you are better able to understand the complex tapestry of connecting threads which make up the big picture. So if you somehow stumbled onto this without listening from the beginning, we highly recommend you go back and start with episode 63, The Stalin Eras, an introduction, 1878-1917. This episode's narrative, titled Triumphs and Tribulations, is part 3 of the series. For those enjoying this series, we strongly encourage you to join our Patreon at patreon.com/Prolespod to get early access to episodes, bonus content, study guides, and an opportunity to submit questions you want us to tackle in our Criticisms of Stalin episode, which we'll be doing once we've finished covering Stalin's life. This episode's narrative begins the tumultuous history of the latter half of the 1930s. We begin covering this controversial era by examining the events of 1935 to 1936, where we will get glimpses of everyday life across the Union, the changing socialist culture in the USSR, the international prestige and the impact of the Soviet Union, the highly progressive 1936 Constitution, the outbreak of the Spanish Civil War, and what all these events entail. We will leave the next episode to cover narratively the Moscow trials and the outbreak of World War II, followed by a discussion episode of the latter 1930s as a whole. We hope that you found this project educational and that you continue on this journey with us. On that note, let us begin.
Life across the Union. There are not many places in the Soviet Union at the dawn of 1935 which welcomed the new year with above freezing temperatures. One exception, though, is the Tajik village of Chakam, that lies at the base of the beautiful Hisar mountain range. But this is where Soviet Ambassador Nikolai Novikov was when the new year came about, on his way to the capital of Stalinabad. By summer, he will be a candidate member of the Central Committee, but as he pontificates on his circumstances in early January, he has no idea how eventful the year will be. I have kept a diary in all sorts of Tajik wilderness, but mostly in regional centers. Now I am writing in a village where I was forced to stay for a few days on business. It is very warm here during the day. The only snow that remains is on the northern slopes. I am always amazed by this sharp contrast with Shurabad. When I left, everything was covered with snow. An icy wind was blowing. I walked around in a sheepskin coat and felt boots. But as soon as I descended from the plateau into the valley, the picture changed dramatically. I live all the time among natural and social contrasts. Near Moscow, 29-year-old Ilya Gudkov is not quite so warm as he settles into a new job teaching Russian to elementary schoolers. On New Year's Eve, heavy dreams tormented me, but the cheerful, sunny morning dispersed them like smoke from a broken stove. Bracing myself for the cold, I hurried to the Young Pioneers Stadium, where I'd been assigned by the school to hold a holiday on ice with the 5th graders. They were so happy when they learned that the Russian teacher would be skating with them. The students rushed around me in a noisy flock. Coming home, I cheerfully carry water for Valya's washing, cheerfully chop wood, cheerfully feed Vova some halva brought from the buffet that was served at the stadium. Only my son, thin after several days of illness, is not inclined to fun. I look at the beautiful prints of the icy hands of frost on the glass of the window, as if they were an enemy, and wrap Vova up tighter. In the evening, I sat for a long time over the New Year's issue of Pravda. The cold insistently made itself felt, but the warmth of the description of the year's great events enveloped me while reading the articles. As if in a kaleidoscope, the events of 1934 quickly passed before me, and I saw them, experienced them. I heard Stalin's voice, metallic through the radio. I greeted the rescued Chelyuskinites with flowers. I rejoiced, like Avdinko in the novel I love, at all the shoots of new life. I was shivering from the frost, which had broken through the wall with icy fangs, but the joy of a new life illuminated my thoughts like dawn. I wanted to shout in Tikhonov's words, "So what if my name is not among those awarded, because my heart is ringing from each of these victories?" In the quickly modernizing urban world of Moscow, 14-year-old student, romantic, and aspiring poet David Samolyov rings the new year in as many fresh adolescents do, emotionally. Finally, the holidays have come. The last few days, I studied poorly. I can't find the motivation. On the 30th, I went skating. Yesterday, we celebrated New Year's Eve at Natasha's. I was in a bad mood and sat in the corner reading Alexander Blok. When all the guys were playing, I moved to the gramophone. My melancholy reached the point that I wanted to leave, but Natasha made me stay. Then the older Natasha came, at the sight of whom my melancholy dissipated completely. The girl attracts me for some reason. She's 17 years old. She's very thin with black eyes. She writes poetry and understands me. I love being around her. She asked me to bring her my poems and promised to give me hers. I promised. I would really like to have her as my friend. She's the only one I can tell what I think and feel, since Zhorik is too cold for this. Vovochka is insincere. Chervik is stupid, and Siegel is slow-witted. When the midnight came, we started going wild and shouting, "Hooray!" Then there was the foxtrot and other such things. We stayed late, until 2:30. Today is the first day of the new year. Last night, the Earth came to the place from where it must once again follow its preordained path around the sun. A new year has arrived. A new year, new hopes. Another year brings me closer to the age when I can work for the benefit of my country. But a dark cloud hung over the end of 1934, and therefore the beginning of 1935. The murder on December 1st, 1934, of Leningrad party leader Sergei Kirov sent shockwaves throughout the Union. Communist Party members specifically looked to their leaders with reverence, as people who had sacrificed and continued to sacrifice so much to benefit the entire population and, as ambassadors of socialism, the whole world. This would be a double-edged sword in the coming years, but we will speak on that later. Before we get into the thick of the crucial year of 1935, we will look back on some diary entries from the time of Kirov's murder and the subsequent closed trial in order to get a better view of how people felt privately. In London, Soviet diplomat Ivan Mikhailovich Maisky had been busy all year trying to secure alliances with France and Britain in the case of war with Germany or Japan. "A terrible misfortune. In Leningrad, in Smolny, Comrade Kirov was killed. Who is the killer? What are his motives? Who sent him? I don't know anything yet. There are rumors. Some say that the killer was an engineer who had a personal grudge against Comrade Kirov. Others, the Daily Express, claim the hand of Alfred Rosenberg, Hitler's adjutant, who was involved in the assassination. I only know one thing for sure. In the obituary signed by Stalin, Molotov, Voroshilov, and others, I caught it on the radio, it said that the killer was sent by class enemies. The news of the assassination arrived by about 9 p.m. By 11:30, the Ozerskys and Alperovich had gathered at my place. Somehow everyone wanted to be together, and to find sympathy and release for the feelings that were troubling the group. They talked, shared their thoughts, assumptions, and guesses. They sent the following telegram to Moscow. Moscow, to Stalin, to Molotov. Deeply shocked by the news of the tragic death of Comrade Kirov, who fell at the hands of the class enemy. We mourn this heavy loss together with the entire country of the Soviets. The death of Comrade Kirov, who was always an example of selfless devotion to the cause of the working class and the Soviet state, will only force us, together with the workers, collective farmers, and employees of the Soviet Union, to rally even more firmly around the Central Committee of the party and its leader, Comrade Stalin, and around the Soviet government in the name of the great struggle to build socialism and create a classless society. On behalf of the Soviet colony in London, Maisky, Ozersky. But still, it's bad. Some completely unexpected break in the line of development that our country has been following for the past year. I wish I knew the details sooner. Then it would be easier to judge the significance of the tragic event. Elena Bulgakova, socialite and wife of playwright Mikhail Bulgakov, was at the theater. In the evening, the premiere of Pickwick, I saw Mikhail off in a taxi. He stayed until the end of the performance. He arrived and reported during the performance it became known that Kirov had been killed in Leningrad. At that very moment, many people left the theater, including Rykov. 56-year-old peasant Dmitry Lugachev from the tiny village of Vashki wrote, "Our beloved leader, Sergei Mironovich Kirov, secretary of the All-Union Central Communist Party of Belarus and the Leningrad Oblast, has died. Been killed by a shot from a villainous hand." Pavel Filanov, poet and artist leader of the Soviet avant-garde movement. In the evening, the radio in my room suddenly, after a whole day of music, singing, and commercials, announced the death of Kirov. It was as if something had hit me in the face with an instantaneous feeling of grief and enormous loss from the death of this man. It seemed as if I myself had lost something dear in him, although I knew absolutely nothing about him, had never seen or heard him, or read a single one of his speeches. My daughter always showed me his speeches. She had long ago, much earlier than me, become interested in his speeches and always admired them in the full sense of the word. But I had studied his face superbly, and I knew from his face what was inside of him. Of course, from the clichés in the newspaper, I don't really know what kind of face Kirov had. Only what was clear to me. It was a collective face. It clearly revealed a certain essence of the party and class to which Kirov belonged. And it revealed it not for a certain period of time, but forever. That it was the face of a warrior, but a worker who had become a warrior. It was the face of a revolutionary whom no torture could force to become a traitor or compromiser. This same face would do honor to any orator and politician, but such a face could also be that of a simple Red Army soldier or sailor, straight from the village, and of a mechanic from, say, the Putilov factory. That is why the murderer shot him, Kirov, in the back of the head, I think, because to shoot Kirov in the face, from the front, would have meant having greater personal courage in himself than Kirov. I think the enemy, going to commit an assassination, did not dare to look Kirov in the face. Shaposhnikova from Leningrad said it right. Losing Kirov, Leningrad women feel the same grief as when losing their own dearly beloved child or dear friend. I think that men could say the same, although these words reveal feelings of loss and not the magnitude of what was lost. Some woman was crying on the tram and, wiping away her tears with a gnarled hand, turning her hand to the tram window, she said shyly, "Such a man was killed. What a good man he was. Like a family member, as if my brother was killed." Outside of the tram station, another woman said, "I feel so sad, like I lost a brother," echoing the phrase uttered an hour before by the crying woman. "He was a rare man. Everyone loved him. 300 of us went to say goodbye to him. And it was the same at other factories. I myself was washing the floor nearby. I was tired, I was frozen, but I went to look at Kirov, and I forgot about the fatigue. And now I would stand there all night, if only to see the farewell." She was no older than 37 years old. 62-year-old Alexandra Kollontai wrote, "An unheard-of atrocity. Kirov was killed. Who are these villains who have murdered such a wonderful, beloved leader of our party? What country, what forces are behind this crime? I was urgently summoned to Stockholm. This is such a grief, such a misfortune, for which there are no words. We don't really know anything yet, and so dark torment and anger oppresses everyone. What is hidden behind this?" The investigation that resulted from Kirov's assassination was believed at the time to be thorough, but was it? As we attempt to prove in this narrative, head of the successor to the GPU, the People's Commissariat for Internal Affairs, or NKVD, Genrikh Yagoda, was not only not Stalin's henchman, as many have claimed, but he was an active member of the Bloc of Rights and Trotskyites. As unlikely as that might seem, given the very narrow scope of quote-unquote acceptable Soviet historiography, it is not as difficult to believe as you might have been told. He consistently sympathized with the right deviation, particularly with Bukharin and Tomsky, in relation to collectivization. He would, while dutifully maintaining his post, continually downplay the role of prominent members of the opposition and the role of Trotsky abroad. This is seen by many liberal scholars as proof of the farce, but there is also a counter-narrative. One of Stalin's former bodyguards, Alexei Rybin, wrote in his memoir, around the time of the collapse of the USSR, "After Kirov was assassinated, the investigation was being conducted by Agranov, Yagoda's assistant, who was falsifying everything. Stalin was becoming suspicious about this and had a commission appointed from the CC to investigate the NKVD. In the personal files of Yagoda, this commission found a right-wing clique opposing the party and, at the same time, files of Tsarist secret police and their agents that were still operational. Agents of the Tsarist police like Zelensky, Zubarev, and Ivanov. Where do you think these agents under the USSR were? Zelensky was the secretary of the Moscow Party Committee. Zubarev was the second secretary of the Sverdlovsk Party Committee. Ivanov was the secretary of the North Caucasus District Party Committee. And on the instructions of Bukharin, organized the hunger epidemic from 1928 to 1934 in order that the people would be dissatisfied with Soviet power. These are the kind of people that supported and helped Yagoda, and before him, Bukharin. Now, perhaps Comrade Rybin, almost 40 years after Stalin's death, in a time when Stalin was incredibly unpopular both abroad and in Glasnost-era Russia, decided to lie in order to protect the memory of his long-dead leader. We shall see. Whether Stalin ordered Kirov's murder or not, and it seemed almost certainly not, no articles or speeches, debates of policy, or the general atmosphere of 1934 and 1935 suggested publicly that there was any plan to terrify the population into submission. By all accounts, the investigations and persecutions were, at least initially, only meant to target a relatively small number of terrorists and oppositionists.
Life has become better. It was winter 1934, and Stalin was vacationing at his dacha when he received an order which he couldn't refuse from an authority higher than the party itself. The document handed directly to him read, "I order you to allow me to go to the theater or the cinema with you." This concise command was signed Svetlana, mistress of the house. After receiving the letter directly from the mistress, Stalin responded resolutely, "I must obey." After all, who could refuse the wish of their 8-year-old daughter? This wasn't the first, nor would it be the last of her commands. Papa, as she affectionately referred to Stalin as, was Svetlana's chief secretary, but she had others that she could call upon when he was indisposed. Their names were Molotov, Kaganovich, and Kirov, to name a few. It was a year later in 1935 when the new metro had opened, and Svetlana's secretary, Kaganovich, had given her tickets to visit and take a ride on Moscow's glorious new monument to public transportation. At the last moment, she asked her father to attend, and, as per usual, it was an offer he couldn't refuse. Unsurprisingly, this spur-of-the-moment visit worried Stalin's bodyguards as well as his advisors. The anxious Kaganovich instead suggested that they visit the metro when it had been closed for the day, but Stalin insisted. According to the private diary of Maria Svendiza, Stalin's sister-in-law, who attended the metro with them that evening, the members of the public they came across while walking to the metro were incredibly enthused to see their leadership out and about. She recounted, "The public rushed to greet the leaders. They cheered and ran alongside us. The enthusiasm and ovations reached superhuman dimensions. The enthusiastic crowd overturned an iron lamppost. Joseph was merry. I think that as austere as he is, he was touched by the people's love for their leader. There was nothing contrived or formal about it." It was in this mid-decade sentiment of public approval that Stalin proclaimed triumphantly, "Life has become better. Life has become more joyous," at a conference of workers in 1935. And taking stock of the ledger over the past 18 years since the revolution, he was right. Rationing was officially ended, government allocations for housing and consumer goods increased, and there was massive price cuts to staple foods. These bold statements signaled an overall change in tone from the Soviet government, but also the strong material push for economic stability and the relaxation of coercive forces that had aided in the now completed era of rapid industrialization and collectivization. It is fair to say that the second five-year plan was much more realistic in its goals and pace as well. The Soviets were learning. Almost paradoxically, to the events that would consume 1936 to 1938, this period began with a general relaxation of many of the strictures of the early 1930s. Many now former kulaks, for example, and religious leaders had their sentences reduced and were released from labor camps, allowed to return to the places they were exiled from. The time of the oft-projected asceticism during the first five-year plan had now given way to an availability of consumer goods in the second five-year plan. Stalin clarified the party line when he stated, "Some people think that socialism can be consolidated by a certain equalization of people's material conditions based on a poor man's standard of living. That is not true. That is a petty bourgeois conception of socialism. In point of fact, socialism can succeed only on the basis of high productivity of labor, higher than under capitalism, on the basis of an abundance of products and articles of consumption of all kinds, on the basis of a prosperous and cultured life for all members of society. But if socialism is to achieve this aim and make our Soviet society the most prosperous of all societies, our country must have a productivity of labor which surpasses that of the foremost capitalist countries. After all, the Soviet people had sacrificed so much over the past 2 decades. This new level of consumerism had been more than earned. It was their right. This new cultured socialist consumerism included caviar, champagne, chocolate, sausages, radios, sewing machines, watches, alarm clocks, motorcycles, and more. The state also began to sanction and fund more entertainment and leisure, creating more vacation rest homes, sporting events, producing literature, films, and other forms of mainstream entertainment. All these luxuries had only been previously available to a very tiny fraction of the wealthy elite, were now available to a much larger percentage of the population. From the stubborn petite bourgeois Muscovites to collective farmers in isolated rural villages. It's important to note that the flourishing of arts and cultural appreciation didn't just apply to urban workers in the center, but also to the far-off regions. For example, cultural centers were developed in the rural region of Kirov. During this era, Kirov city saw the building of the House of Soviets, the Drama Theater, the Central Hotel, and the October Movie Theater. At the same time, the local government demolished monuments of the Old World, such as the Alexander Nevsky Church, as a way to break the old consciousness and replace it with a Sovietized one. Astoundingly, in 1936, 667 collective farm and workers' clubs and 50 houses of culture were opened in the region. These institutions would play a vital role in the countryside as they provided the primary point of contact between the rural population and the state and party, which sent officials and representatives out to conduct lectures, readings, meetings, and other key events. On top of this explosion in Soviet cultural life, the free market had been formally eliminated, the bourgeois thoroughly expropriated, and the state definitively ran the economy, not private interests or individual capitalists. Regardless of one's perspective, the Soviet Union, against all odds, had incarnated the capitalist world's greatest fear, the specter of communism, and turned it into a living, breathing socialist state. None of this was to say that the Soviet Union had become an instant utopia, that each of its citizens lived blissfully and believed in socialism, that every system worked, that consumer goods were accessible to all in abundance at all times, every time, or that fractionary thought disappeared. But rather, what the mid-30s demonstrated was that if the course stayed, improvements to the material conditions of all Soviet citizens were unavoidable. Stalin's quote about life becoming more joyous and happy was, of course, memified both by the state in its propaganda and everyday citizens in their frustrations with the Soviet system and even in their humor. A worker in this period wrote in a letter to a Soviet official, "In fact, there's been 20 years of Soviet power. 15 to 16 of these have been peaceful construction. The people struggled with zeal, overcame difficulties. Socialism has been built in the main. As we embark on the third 5-year plan, we shout at meetings, congresses, and in newspapers, 'Hooray, we have reached a happy, joyous life.' However, incidentally, if one is to be honest, these shouts are mechanical, made from habit, pumped by social organizations. The ordinary person makes such speeches like a street newspaper seller. In fact, in his heart, when he comes home, this baller, zoologist will agree with his family, his wife who reproaches him that today she's been torturing herself in queues and did not get anything. There are no suits, no coats, no meats, no butter." In terms of a more humorous approach to uneven conditions, a popular joke went as follows. High party officials from the center, Moscow, were inspecting a psychiatric hospital somewhere in the provinces. As they walked into a ward, all the patients rose and chanted, "Life has gotten better. Life has become more joyful." The officials were pleased that the slogan had reached so far, but noticed that one little fellow standing in a corner hadn't joined in. "Why?" they asked him. "Didn't you just say life has gotten better?" And the man in the corner responded, "Excuse me, I'm not crazy. I just work here."
Socialist realism. In order to understand the formation of the first All-Union Congress of Soviet Writers in late 1934 and the subsequent push for socialist realism, we must first understand the state of Soviet art at the time. Before the Congress, specifically communist writers had formed in 1928 the Russian Association of Proletarian Writers, or RAP, whose goal was to execute proletarian hegemony over Soviet literature. Rap never achieved its goals, and, while significant, never eclipsed the more famous non-communist writers. They fought in papers and periodicals against political deviations in creative works of the time. Stalin, ever the pragmatist, while appreciating the movement that he had a part in creating, was under no delusions. In 1929, Rap asked why Mikhail Bulgakov, a non-communist playwright who had recently published a play about the White Army movements during the Civil War, was being produced so often. Stalin responded, "Probably because we don't have enough of our own plays good enough for staging. In a land without fish, even Bulgakov's play is a fish. It is easy to criticize and demand a ban on non-proletarian literature, but easiest is not always best. It is not a matter of ban, but of competition. Only in a situation of competition can we achieve the formation and crystallization of our own proletarian literature." Later, he wrote again, "I cannot demand of a literary author that he must be a communist and that he must follow the party point of view. For belletristic literature, other standards are needed: non-revolutionary and revolutionary, Soviet and non-Soviet, proletarian and non-proletarian. But to demand that literature be communist, this is impossible. To demand that belletristic literature and that author follow the party line, then all non-party people would have to be driven out." In a particularly combative presentation at the 16th Party Congress in 1930, Rap led a campaign for strictly proletarian literature. It was not adopted. And by April 1932, the Politburo had decided to abolish rap, as they felt it had become an impediment to the progress of Soviet art. They would instead work toward the creation of a union that would join the writers of the CPSU with all writers who had supported Soviet power and the construction of socialism. At an informal meeting of communist writers in October of that year, at Maxim Gorky's home, Stalin was asked about non-party writers and their lack of understanding with regards to Marxist dialectics. He responded, "Tolstoy, Cervantes, and Shakespeare were not dialecticians, but that did not stop them from being great artists. They were great artists, and their works reflected their epochs quite well. Those who argue that writers should learn dialectics do not understand that writers have to study the classics of literature as well as those of Marxism. Lenin taught us that without the knowledge and preserved experience of past human culture, we won't be able to build a new socialist culture." He went on to note that Romanticism, while idealistic and an embellishment of reality, was not a monolith. That Shakespeare's Romanticism was different from Schiller's, who was different from Gorky's radical Romanticism that had portrayed a rising class struggling for power and the future. "Revolutionary socialist realism must be the main current in literature of our epoch. But that doesn't exclude making use of the writers and methods of the Romantic school," Stalin said. A week later, there was another informal meeting at Gorky's home, this time with both party and non-party writers. Stalin began with a point he hadn't addressed at the previous meeting, but apparently wanted to. "I forgot to talk about what you are producing. There are different products: artillery, automobiles, machines. You also produce commodities, works, products, very important things, interesting things. People's souls. You are the engineers of human souls. Production of souls is more important than production of tanks. Man is remade by life itself, but you too will assist in remaking his soul. This is important, the production of human souls. That is why I propose a toast to writers, to the engineers of human souls." When someone asked again about art and dialectics, Stalin expanded on his earlier thesis, first with a joke, characteristic of his dry humor. "An artist might be a dialectical materialist, but I will say that they will not then want to write poetry. I'm joking, of course, but seriously, you mustn't stuff an artist's head with abstract theses. They must know the theories of Marx and Lenin, but they must know life. An artist must be able to portray life truthfully. And if they show our life truthfully, they cannot but show it as leading to socialism. That will be socialist art. That will be socialist realism." Stalin might not have loved these statements looking back, as he specifically omitted the printed article of them from his official collected works, but it did not matter. It was hard for Stalin to say anything without it being taken as, ironically, gospel. Stalin did not attend the Congress of the First All-Union Congress of Soviet Writers on the 8th of August, 1934, but that did not stop the secretary of the CPSU, Andrei Zhdanov, from invoking him. Comrade Stalin has called our writers engineers of human souls. What does that mean? In the first place, it means knowing life, so as to be able to depict it truthfully in works of art. The truthfulness and historic concreteness of the artistic portrayal should be combined with the ideological remolding and education of the toiling people in the spirit of socialism. This method is what we call socialist realism. To be an engineer of human souls means standing with both feet planted on the basis of real life, and this in turn denotes a rupture with romanticism of the old type. Our literature cannot be hostile to romanticism, but it must be a romanticism of a new type, revolutionary romanticism. Soviet literature should be able to portray our heroes. It should be able to glimpse our tomorrow. One cannot be an engineer of the human soul without knowing the technique of literary work. You have many types of weapons, genres, styles, forms and methods of literary creation, the mastery of the technique of writing, the critical assimilation of the literary heritage of all epochs represents a task which you must fulfill without fail, if you wish to become engineers of human souls. In 1937, when asked again about the role of writers, Stalin said, "If they are in touch with the present needs of the masses, a writer can play an important role in the development of society. They capture vague feelings and unconscious moods of the advanced sectors of society, and make explicit the instinctive actions of the masses. They shape the epoch's public opinion. They help society's vanguard realize its task." And so it was that socialist realism became the government-supported form of art production, which was very much in line with the new outlook and presentation of the Soviet state of society, or rather, what society is both becoming and can be. Socialist realism was presented as a concept which could be used to bridge the gap between the admittedly still uneven material conditions and socialist expectations. But it was more than an art form. It was a worldview, a way of understanding and interpreting life in this transition period of socialist construction. This was a notable shift from the previously supported avant-garde forms of Soviet art from the 1920s. This shift resulted from the party's desire that art connect with common people in a way much of the Soviet avant-garde was not at the time. Perhaps what made socialist realism unique amongst art styles is that it was an official state project. Critics of the Soviet Union declared this mandate as restrictive imposition and further evidence of socialist tyranny. However, other ruling classes in the past and present, whether the aristocracy or the bourgeoisie, had enforced artistic styles either through sponsorship or personal taste. Should the proletariat not have the same right? Andrei Zhdanov said this about the institution of socialist realism in the First All-Union Congress of Soviet Writers. "To be an engineer of the human soul is to stand foursquare on real life. And this, in turn, means a break with old-style romanticism, with the romanticism which depicted a non-existent life and non-existent heroes, drawing the reader away from the contradictions and shackles of a life into an unrealizable and utopian world. Soviet literature must be able to portray our heroes and see our tomorrow. This will not be utopian, since our tomorrow is being prepared by planned and conscious work today."
The North Star is red. From a global perspective, the Soviet Union was seen as a city on a hill for both colonized peoples and workers of capitalist imperial core countries. They'd gone through several stages of successful development and demonstrated it possible for oppressed peoples to take power, maintain power, and reshape their society in a way that was built for them. All this was well before the decolonization movement of the mid-20th century, when white supremacy was proudly the overt face of capitalism. The Soviet project, as we have covered in previous episodes, used its international spotlight to promote anti-racism within and outside its borders. An example of this can be seen in what is purported to be one of Stalin's favorite movies, entitled The Circus, featuring Soviet starlet Lyubov Orlova. This 1936 film told the story of a white woman who was chased out of the US because she had a child with a black man. She finds herself in the Soviet Union after her partner had been lynched, where she's now free to live with her son in a world without racial prejudice. The film was a sharp rebuke against racist ideologies. To provide contrast, it was only 3 years later that the racist, white supremacist, slavery idealizing movie, Gone with the Wind, would win the Oscar for Best Picture in the American Academy Awards. For the working class people of the imperial core countries, the USSR demonstrated an alternative way to organize society that had workers' health, well-being, and interest at the forefront. Soviet experiments in child-rearing, sciences, healthcare, virtually every field of human life drew the interests of progressive people the world over. The Soviet Union was happy to have them come in order to share their new project with like-minded persons or fellow travelers, potentially win over those opposed to the project, and most importantly, through the 1930s, to gain expertise from more developed nations through recruitment of their workers. The 1930s was overshadowed in the West by the Great Depression, a major crisis of capitalism, which saw many of the global proletariat unemployed. Engineers, contractors, farmers, and the like who would end up migrating to the Soviet Union during this period from the US and other countries did so out of curiosity, socialist beliefs, or, like most people, the need to work so that they could survive. Geopolitical concerns be damned. To anyone paying attention in the 30s, the Soviet system was defying global trends. Paul R. Gregory and Joel Saylors, members of the Hoover Institute, an institution that is no friend to communism, had this to say about the Soviet economic system at this time. Having created an administrative command system designed to insulate the domestic economy from demand and external shocks and independent of international capital flows, the Soviet economy experienced rapid economic growth and industrial transformation during the very period when other economies were stagnating. Moreover, the Soviet Union was the sole case of a country that followed a deliberate development strategy executed by administrative actions rather than markets to oversee its rapid industrialization. It was this exceptional Soviet experience that lent it much of its appeal in the 1950s and 1960s in Western Europe, and more so in Africa, Asia, and Latin America. A personal example of the transformative power of the Soviet experience can be seen in the story of Canadian doctor Norman Bethune, who upon his death in the 1960s would receive a eulogy published in the People's Republic of China, written by Chairman Mao Zedong himself. In the mid-1930s, while Bethune had not committed to explicitly promoting communism, he was still progressive. However, in 1935, he was encouraged by a comrade to attend the International Physiological Congress in Moscow and Leningrad. He wanted to learn if things were actually better in the Soviet system and that it was not just rose-tinted propaganda. On this trip, Bethune, a medical physician, was astounded by several facts of the USSR: that all children were tested to detect early tuberculosis, that there were halfway homes for convalescents from tuberculosis who were joining the workforce again, and that there were medical stations and clinics in factories. He was also spellbound by how the love of children was exemplified in the universal daycare system, which he perceived as not rigid and formulaic, as Western propaganda suggested at the time, but full of warmth and laughter. Bethune returned home to Canada a convinced communist and brought back with him these ideas of the universal healthcare system. And he was not alone in this endeavor. Many physicians who visited the Soviet Union in the 1930s returned to their homes across the imperial core and played vital roles in laying the groundwork for the emergence of universal healthcare systems in the West during the post-war period. Such admiration and positive feelings existed in the sciences as well. Nikola Tesla, famed inventor, always valued the worker-centric and pro-scientific nature of Soviet society, stating in his diary, "I often regret that at the time I chose the United States instead of Russia. There was no difference then. In the meantime, with the appearance of the USSR, everything had changed radically. It is now significantly different from the rest of the world. The newspapers pour shit on it, but those who come from there say incredible things. I was most intrigued by the Soviet system of science. Their scientists are provided with a salary and necessary working conditions. They are freed from daily duties, concentrating exclusively on science. They don't have to think about who will finance them. When the state, a socialist state, is behind you and not a rich man who can change his mind at any moment, that is reliable. I often think about how I would go to the USSR if only I was 15 or 20 years younger. I had the opportunity to go to Moscow. I still have it now, but I'm too old for such a big step. I am following the situation in Russia carefully. I try to get testimonies from eyewitnesses, not from newspapers that lie non-stop. I approve of the Russian Revolution because it proclaimed the principle of honesty on 1/6 of the Earth's surface. The Soviet Union faces incredible trials, but the country is ready to overcome them. The Russians are lucky. They have socialism and Stalin. These diaries, written in the late 30s, early 40s, featured Tesla reflecting on this history of the Soviet Union. In those early days, he was a friend of Lenin himself. They had correspondences with each other, and Lenin actually invited him to come, but at the time, Tesla declined. He still harbored much regret for telling Lenin during the revolution that his electrification plan for the Soviet Union, Goelro, as it was known, was impossible. But as we have covered in this series, in the Soviet Union, nothing was impossible. Travelogues of Western women who visited through the Soviet in-tourist system had much to say about the emancipation of women across the country, particularly when compared on relative terms to their home countries. Agnes MacPhail, the first female woman in the Canadian Parliament, had much to say about her visit to the USSR in the 30s. And like many of these travelers, upon return, they inadvertently became apostles of socialist construction, spreading the good news of Lenin, thus Stalin. MacPhail would say this about her experience. I felt the upsurging energy of a people suppressed for centuries, fighting its way through inefficiency, ignorance, and dirt to meet the challenge of Lenin's upflung arm shown in countless statues throughout Russia. However deeply troubled we as Democrats are over the lack of justice as we understand it shown again in Russia, we cannot but be moved with admiration of their achievements. The organization of clinics, mother and child institutes, centers for the treatment of accidents, parks of culture, and the rest, and great sports grounds with stadiums all over the Soviet Union is so good as to seem unbelievable. Agriculture in Russia is on the march. Gigantic efforts are being made to increase the quality and quantity of their products and to improve the standard of living of the peasants. Life now on the farms is an immense improvement over the conditions of peasants in the old days. MacPhail was also impressed with the cleanliness and facilities of the Thalmann collective farm. Despite its flaws, this was a deeply committed socialist state with a rebounding cultural, internal, and global prominence. And the continued flourishing and stability of the system, the mid-1930s, would allow for the expansion of a core communist tenet: democracy.
The Soviet Constitution and Soviet democracy. In the mid-1930s, so-called democracy based on universal suffrage was still a relatively new experiment in Europe. This undeniably bourgeois form of democracy had its obvious caveats to true universality, namely the hundreds of millions of colonized peoples who had no voting rights, let alone meaningful representation in their colonial governance. These colonial systems ruled over large swaths of the racialized world fascistically. And for those who made their way to the colonial metropoles, whether by force or choice, would find themselves at the mercy of a domestic system of virulent white supremacy. Indigenous peoples had also been corralled into extensive reservation systems, while having their cultures and ways of life destroyed in order to maintain settler dominion over their lands across the regions known as the Americas, Australia, New Zealand, and even parts of Africa. In the preceding 150 years, enslaved people, proletarians, and the colonized, from Haiti to Hungary, had fought for their human rights. Impeding this progress was the imperialist nature of capitalism, which at its highest stage had now been firmly entrenched. After the terror of World War I, not even European workers could confidently presume that capitalist democracy worked, or rather, worked for anyone, other than the wealthy elites and surviving elements of the landed aristocracy. The Soviet Union's socialist experiment diverted its member nations from the path of Western liberal democracy, freeing tens of millions of people from its crushing grasp. Regardless of its stated goals, the reality of liberalism is built upon ensuring the privileged position of the opulent minority while keeping the working majority entranced by the facade of a universal suffrage. In 1787, Founding Father James Madison made plain the nature of the newly formed United States government during its Constitutional Convention. In England at this day, if elections were open to all classes of people, the property of landed proprietors would be insecure. An agrarian law would soon take place, undermining the right to property. Our government ought to secure the permanent interests of the country against innovation, arranging voting patterns and checks and balances so as to protect the minority of the opulent against the majority. In other words, according to Madison, if we gave the masses real democracy, they would vote to have the ruling class's land and private property redistributed among them in an equitable manner. The horror. The mask, which had been kept intact by the crumbs fed largely to the white proletariat of the imperialist core at the expense of the colonized, had begun to slip noticeably by the mid-1930s. Anna Louise Strong observed during this time that the threat of fascism to the peoples of the earth is no empty one. Of 26 European countries, democratic rights survive today in only 10. 16 are ruled by fascist or semi-fascist governments. Even in the so-called democratic lands, democracy is on the defensive or in full retreat. In country after country, the demand to outlaw the parties of the left is already a matter of practical politics. Armed clashes between workers and fascists take place in the streets of London and Paris. For daring to be loyal to a democratically elected government, the city of Madrid is bombed from the face of the earth, while the greatest democratic governments of the world wreck the whole structure of international law in their frenzy to avoid giving aid. The bombing of Madrid here refers to the Spanish Civil War, which we will address shortly. The contemporary constitution had been instituted in 1924, itself preceded by the first Soviet constitution in 1918, at a time when the new economic program was still in effect and well before the rapid industrialization and collective farming had begun. Now, in 1935, despite a mere 13 years passing since the end of the Civil War, Soviet society had advanced rapidly, and its material conditions changed drastically. This new epoch and victory of socialism attained in the Soviet Union logically required a new constitution, a new socialist contract. Early that year, a group of 31 men, headed by Stalin, formed a commission. Prominent figures of this team included Radek, Bukharin, Molotov, Kaganovich, Litvinov, and Vyshinsky, to name a few. In June 1936, this draft was submitted for public review. In the following 6 months, about 42,372,990 Soviet citizens participated in the review of this draft document, which saw 43,000 suggested changes provided by the public. This was arguably the largest public mobilization campaign in history. Meetings of varying success were held across the country in which average Soviet citizens provided feedback, which was collected and sent back to the center. Contrary to popular perceptions, the Soviet Union not only sought but required popular participation from the public in order to function. The new constitution was the centerpiece of Stalin's legal and state-building efforts in the mid-1930s. For those who may doubt the legitimacy of this project as cynical or a propaganda exercise, there are no documents in the archival record to contradict the Soviet leadership's public support for a more participatory constitution or to indicate they viewed the Constitution and the subsequent discussion as mere propaganda. On the contrary, Stalin and his team meticulously edited this document and demanded regional officials collect extensive feedback. The new constitution recognized collective social and economic rights, including the rights to work, rest and leisure, health protection, care in old age as well as sickness, housing, education, and cultural benefits. Article 123 established equality of rights for all citizens, irrespective of their nationality or race, in all spheres of economic, state, cultural, social, and political life. Advocacy of racial or national exclusiveness, or hatred or contempt, or restrictions of rights and privileges on account of nationality were to be punished by law. Anti-communist historian Stephen Kotkin even wrote, "Not only could the USSR under Stalin plausibly claim that it had developed the programs and practices of state-guaranteed social welfare to a greater extent than had previously been the case anywhere, but it could do so in a way which contrasted with the fascist reaction, by embracing fully the illustrious European heritage known as the Enlightenment." There is no doubt that the Soviet Union was using democratic reforms in Europe as one source of inspiration. As Molotov noted, "All the best parts of the democratic system of other states we brought in and added to our constitution to apply to the conditions of the Soviet state." Molotov, like Stalin, focused on the idea of asserting democratic control over the regional and local organs of power by means of secret, participatory elections. He noted that the new electoral system would secure the complete development of democracy and would help to improve the state apparatus through the expansion and renewal of leading Soviet cadres and the elevation of working people to the party organization. In other words, from the position of Soviet leadership, democracy was a tool to turn against the bureaucratic and unresponsive regional and local organizations which had consistently frustrated central authorities with corruption and incompetence. In addition to supplying new cadres with strong ties to the working people, Molotov stated, "The new elections will shake up the weak and strike out at bureaucratism." But multi-candidate elections featuring non-CPSU candidates were a point of contention. Many people were understandably afraid that former kulaks and the like would return to power. Previously a logistical impossibility, the new constitution would have allowed the Leshensty, kulaks, priests, capitalists, etc., to regain voting rights. This was a redefinition of citizenship, and a sticking point for many among the proletariat. As demonstrated throughout this series, on important Soviet matters, Stalin played a significant role in bookending the discussion. First, by contributing to the formulation of the draft, by examining the outcome of the popular discussion, and by giving his support for the ratification. The draft document was the result of a collective effort by leading party members and state officials who shared a common vision of the role and purpose of a constitution. Tal Yakovlev and Stetsky were chiefly responsible, and not Nikolai Bukharin as had been previously thought. The draft constitution revision process was used by the people to voice their concerns about Soviet society at large, exposing some of the tensions which existed. Unsurprisingly, collective farmers had much to say during this process. Being out in rural areas, far from central power, collective farms were generally able to run their own affairs unhindered. For example, expelling and admitting members to the collective farm. Ironically, many of the liberalizing reforms proposed by Stalin were not welcomed by the masses. Habeas corpus, for example, meaning the judge or court should and must confirm the legality of any person's detention or imprisonment. Those living in rural areas were not fans of this innovation, as they wanted the ability to arrest disruptive individuals without having to go through the Soviet judiciary. Being far from the center of state power allowed for violent crime to flourish, particularly against the leadership of collective farms. In a letter entitled, "Is It Not Early?" published in the newspaper Leninsky Put, factory worker Alexander Agalikov expressed the following concerns. In Article 127, it says that no citizen of the USSR can be deprived of personal freedom or placed under arrest without the agreement of the court or the sanctions of the prosecutor. In my opinion, this is incorrect. We have not once and for all eliminated hooliganism. Hooligans sometimes insult and attack passers-by, and, in light of this, the policeman doesn't have the right to arrest such a person? In my opinion, this must even be done by any honest citizen. When we have finally eliminated hooliganism, then this article can be adopted. But now, in my opinion, it is too early. Such complaints were common, and demonstrate that Soviet citizens were not shy about agitating for their interests, even if they conflicted with those of the state. Even less educated rural inhabitants were comfortable and politically astute enough to challenge or use Soviet laws to further those interests. The party and the Soviet state had always been very conscious of public opinion and experimented with various ways of eliciting public opinion and support. By 1922, letter writing had become institutionalized as a source of information and a means of encouraging participation. The state sought to harness this enthusiasm and turn public opinion into a force for establishing institutional forms of control, particularly in the periphery, where the local party and state apparatus seemed, at times, beyond the center's governance. In the late 1920s and early 1930s, workers and peasants took on the roles of the eyes and ears of the party in the countryside, reporting on local officials who were not fulfilling their duties, on the successes and failures of various campaigns, and other issues. Letters were a means to petition those in positions of authority, asking for a job, expressing opinions for or against the party line, settling private disputes, or seeking redress for injustice. The Soviet Union in the 1930s extended the concept of democracy beyond the voting booth and into the workplace. Stalin encouraged grassroots participation, urging workers to hold their managers accountable for maintaining efficient workplaces. Soviet newspapers, such as Izvestia, provided a platform for workers to voice their concerns and expose poor working conditions. This, quote-unquote, criticism from below was actively encouraged by the Soviet leadership as a form of democratic participation. So, how does one square this radical democracy with the fact that the CPSU was the only party for which anyone could vote? As Soviet historian and expert on the 1936 Constitution, Samantha Lom puts it, the central leadership did not view single-party rule and popular participation as antithetical. Indeed, leaders encouraged popular participation within a strict framework as a way to strengthen social and economic development in the USSR. As the summer of 1935 was winding down in the Donbass region, 30-year-old Alexei Stakhanov found himself restless and determined to demonstrate that more could be done in service to the worker state. Daily quotas were decided via a back-and-forth conversation beginning at the Supreme Soviet and ending at individual factories, mines, workshops, and so on. The push and pull between what the nation required and what the workers felt they could accomplish was constantly in flux. On August 31st, during a single 6-hour shift, Stakhanov mined 102 tons of coal. This was a staggering 14 times the daily quota. This feat was attributed to his innovative approach of separating the tasks of coal cutting and timbering, allowing for significantly greater efficiency. The Soviet government was already promoting the idea of socialist competition in order to drive better workplace participation. Immediately, Stakhanov was elevated via media and public speeches as a paragon of the new Soviet worker, one dedicated to a rapid path to communism via unwavering dedication. This concept caught fire among workers and spread throughout the Union, spawning the Stakhanovite movement in workplaces everywhere. These acts of worker empowerment served to validate the government and its goals. For example, Matvey Tubilov, a member of one rural Soviet, highlighted the contrast between his family's lack of political voice under Tsarist rule and his own election to his local Soviet at the age of 24. He attributed his family's improved lifestyle, including owning livestock and a bicycle, to the opportunities provided by Soviet power. Similarly, A.P. Smirtina, a section leader on a collective farm, described her transformation from an illiterate peasant to a Stakhanovite worker with full citizenship rights. She emphasized the unique opportunities afforded to her by the state for civic participation. These testimonials reinforced the Soviet Union as a worker-centric state which prioritized the welfare of workers and peasants, contrasting it with the exploitation experienced by workers in capitalist countries. As one American recalled, "There are no bosses to drive fear into the workers, no one to drive them in mad speed-ups. Here, the workers are in control. Even the shop superintendent had no more right in these meetings than any other worker. I have witnessed many times already, when the superintendent spoke too long, the workers in the hall decided he had already consumed enough time and the floor was given to a machine worker who told of his problems and offered suggestions. Imagine this at Ford or Briggs. This is what the outside world calls the ruthless dictatorship in Russia? I tell you, in all the countries we have thus far been in, we have never found such genuine proletarian democracy."
The Spanish Civil War and collective security. While Stalin at this time was clearly optimistic about the Soviet Union's internal progress, the rise of fascism in Europe posed a significant external threat. Facing the growing threat of fascism, the Comintern adopted a popular front strategy, encouraging alliances with broader leftist and anti-fascist groups. The Communist International was a Soviet-led international organization founded in 1919 by Lenin to promote global proletarian struggle. Throughout its existence, it had adjusted its tactics. Initially focusing on inciting proletarian revolution, it later shifted towards alliances with non-communist worker-centric groups, when global revolution seemed unlikely. This more rigid approach changed for the more inclusive Popular Front strategy with the rise of Nazism in 1933. Particularly in the aftermath of the brutal suppression of the German Communist Party. This new approach led to the formation of Popular Front governments in Chile, France, and most notably, the Spanish Republic. The Second Spanish Republic was founded in 1931 following the overthrow of King Alfonso XIII. This Spanish experiment with democracy and modernization saw a tremendous rise in proletarian consciousness and struggle, which resulted in the election of an anti-fascist Popular Front government in 1936. This new government found itself immediately threatened by internal fascist plotters. As General Secretary of the Comintern from 1935 to 1940, Bulgarian communist Georgy Dimitrov stated the following as being top priorities of the organization. 1. To exert every effort to help the Spanish people to crush the fascist rebels. 2. Not to allow the People's Front in France to be discredited or disrupted. 3. To hasten by every means the establishment of a World People's Front of struggle against fascism and war. All these tasks are closely linked. The most urgent, though, of these tasks, the very first at the present moment, is that of organizing international aid to the Spanish people for their victory over fascism. The course of development in all the capitalist countries in the near future will depend a great deal upon the outcome of the struggle of the Spanish people against the fascist brigands. The action undertaken by the fascists in Spain has shown once more that fascism is not only the bitterest enemy of the proletariat, the enemy of the Soviet, socialist republics, but the enemy of every form of liberty of every democratic country, even if its political and economic regime does not go beyond the bounds of bourgeois society. And these concerns of Dimitrov were well founded, as a coup of fascist forces led by General Francisco Franco began in the summer of 1936. These fascist usurpers argued that the motley crew of leftists, which formed the Popular Front government, was a communist conspiracy against God and humanity. Or as Franco put it, he was on a mission to save Spain from Marxism, whatever the cost. Those who supported the democratically elected Popular Front anti-fascist government during this conflict were known as Republican loyalists. The emergence of this conflict clearly upset the post-World War I order. How were the liberal capitalist countries to respond? Unsurprisingly, countries like Britain, France, and other Western European countries declared neutrality and a policy of non-intervention in this conflict. Perhaps as a move to not upset the order any further, and with the hope of proletarian victory in Spain, the Soviet Union also agreed at the start to a policy of non-intervention. However, despite an agreement in the League of Nations, predecessor to the United Nations, Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy, within a week of the start of the conflict in Spain, began to send aid to the counter-revolutionary forces, which was in clear breach of the agreed-to policy of non-intervention. This was done with little meaningful outrage or action on the part of Britain and France, and on the contrary, these countries, among others, blocked the Spanish Republic's right under international law to purchase weapons. The Soviet Union attempted to hold on to its non-interventionist policy until September 1936, when Stalin ordered Operation X, as it became clear someone had to stand with Spain and curb the growth of fascism in Europe. This operation included the sale of weapons to the Republican loyalists, along with personnel and material. Anti-fascist solidarity swept the USSR with the full-throated support of the government. A couple weeks after the coup in Spain, for example, Soviet journalist Michael Koltsov wrote of his experience at the Stalin plant, where mechanic Klevenchko said, "During the years of the Civil War, when we, Russian proletarians, repelled the onslaught of the White Guards and interventionists, the proletarians of the West helped us. Our sacred duty is now to help morally and materially our Spanish brothers, who are heroically defending their freedom. I propose to deduct 0.5% of our monthly earnings in favor of the Spanish people and send a fiery greeting to those who are now fighting the fascists with weapons in their hands." Koltsov went on. In 6 days, the workers' collections to help the Spanish fighters for the Republic yielded a sum of 12,145,000 rubles. On behalf of the All-Union Central Council of Trade Unions, Schwernik transferred this sum in francs, that is 36,435,000 francs, to the Prime Minister of Spain, Girol, at the disposal of the Spanish government. Around the same time, Pravda quoted one automobile assembly line worker as saying, "We see how quickly fascists from different states will unite when the task is the asphyxiation of the working class. Through our relief aid, we will show the fascists that no country will be cut off from the workers of the rest of the world. The cause of Spain is our own cause." During the conflict, thousands of Spanish orphans were sent to the USSR, where they would become known as Stalin's Niños. They were sent to the Soviet Union as a way to protect them from the conflict. Valuable Spanish artifacts were sent as well to the Soviet Union to be protected and presented at the Museum of Revolution. As noted earlier, the USSR sent thousands of personnel, and perhaps most importantly, through the Comintern, they recruited over 50,000 men and women from around the world to fight as part of the international brigades of the Spanish Republic. Were these extensive examples of solidarity surprising? Stalin answered this question by stating, "The workers of the Soviet Union are merely carrying out their duty in giving help within their power to the revolutionary masses of Spain. They are aware that the liberation of Spain from the yoke of fascist reactionaries is not a private affair of the Spanish people, but the common cause of the whole of advanced and progressive mankind." Perhaps personally, Stalin saw in this conflict not a civil war, but a war intervention to destroy even the glimmer of socialism in Spain, something the Soviet Union itself experienced during its own so-called civil war. This and other reasons may have been why Stalin was actively engaged in the defense of the Spanish Republic, and able to take measure of the rolling crises of politics in Spain, as well as grasping necessities of the war effort itself. He was flexible. He never hesitated to adjust this way or that way regarding the shipment of materiel bound for Spanish ports. Stalin even weighed in on the minutiae of the rhetorical strategies of the Republic's propaganda initiatives, expressing strong opinions. For example, he objected to the loyalist slogan, "No pasarán," or "They shall not pass," condemning it as too passive and reflective of a defensive rather than offensive military struggle that was needed to repel Franco and his fascist hordes. Though Stalin was concerned, he was not pulling the strings. Soviet historian William J. Chase had this to say regarding many popular anti-communist stances on the Soviet role in defending the Spanish Republic, writing, "Some writers continue to cling to the view that the Spanish Communist Party and the Republic's leaders were little more than vehicles for Moscow's policies, and that the NKVD had free rein in Spain. The evidence available today shows how flawed such arguments are. Appreciating the role and limits of Soviet efforts in Spain helps one to understand the Kremlin's increasing anxieties about Britain and France's anemic response to Hitler's militarism and signing the Munich Accords, which confirmed Stalin's distrust of them and contributed to agreeing to the 1939 Non-Aggression Pact, which exemplifies his willingness to use realpolitik in defense of socialism in one country. Here, Chase brings up an important but often overlooked aspect of Soviet foreign policy of the 1930s, the policy of collective security and the forming of an anti-Hitler coalition in Europe. Beginning in 1933, this was the absolute policy of the Soviet government, represented by Maxim Litvinov, the People's Commissar for Foreign Affairs. From the standpoint of the Soviet Union's foreign policy, there was really one main thing on the menu: the prevention of war against the Soviet Union. After all, it had barely been a decade since the end of the Civil War and the rise of fascism in Italy under Benito Mussolini and in Germany under Hitler. The Soviet government could not afford to sit idle while these countries bent on the extermination of the Soviet Union shored up their position without resistance from the international community. The Soviets knew the Nazis would one day attack them. This was clear. The anti-Marxist rhetoric of their government was bombastic, their portrayal of the Soviet Union being the product of a Jewish cabal, anti-racist in orientation, and probably multi-ethnic, made it a clear ideological enemy. And most importantly, the Soviet Union was home to vast land and resources, as well as labor that could be exploited by the industrial capitalists backing Hitler in Germany. The complete abdication of liberal democracies and adequately fighting fascism in Spain and elsewhere on the European continent left the Soviet Union isolated and growing increasingly worried about the Spanish conflict being a precursor to a war against it. In October 1936, the fascist rebel Spanish general, Emilio Mola, hosted a press conference. And it was during this press conference, he showed a series of maps showing the positions of the 4 columns of troops advancing towards the capital, Madrid. One of the journalists in attendance asked which of these 4 columns would reach the city first to take it away from the Republican loyalists. It's here that Mola reportedly introduced a previously unnoted 5th column already inside Madrid. Or as he put it, men now in hiding who will rise and support us the moment we march. Stalin wasn't surprised by this idea of a 5th column operating within a loyalist stronghold. After all, at this point in time in 1936, the Soviet Union had begun to deal with its 5th column. Thank you all so much for listening to this episode. I did want to take the time here to show special appreciation to our recent Patreon subscribers, which if you're interested in joining, you can join at patreon.com/Prolespod, where we have access to bonus content, study guides, and other goodies. So I'd like to thank specifically Peter, Ignacio, Colin, New Athens Creative, Mattia98, Spectre of Joe H, Ryan S, Leo S, The Devil's Fire, Fatiz O, The Commune, Dumpy, Chris K, Hans A, Bobby, Meech, Patrick, Anthony M, Kenneth G, Mickey A, Joseph G, Jack S, Jackson L, Todd Carpian, Derek, Ben, Blurrsville, Michael, Daniel N W, and Powell M. Thank you so much for allowing us to be able to take this project the directions that we want to go. Until next time, solidarity forever.